Well, welcome to another episode of The Deep Dive, in which we take a deeper look at the topic or passage of focus from the weekend's message. My name is Brad. I'm joined by Dan. Did we do last week's together? I think so. X13?
Yes.
I don't know. They all kind of blur together, this story of...
I would like to highlight something that's a feature.
Go for it.
So my back is still kind of stiff.
Oh,
So I have lowered my chair.
okay.
But the last people to use this table are tall people.
Uh-huh.
And your chair's still up and my chair's way down here. So just enjoy the optics of the height differential.
And now everyone who's listening on podcast form is leaving and going to YouTube right now to see.
That's right. Dan resting his chin on the table while they're talking.
I'm sorry, we should have put the table at standing height.
Oh, no. I could have asked.
Well, anyway, today we are continuing in our series, The Church the World Needs, going through the book
That
of...
is.
Love it. Going through the book of Acts, and this past weekend, we were in Acts chapter 15, and we had kind of a unique message format. There were you, me, and Paul. We're all...
Yes.
We kind of did the message together. Well, we did the message together.
Yeah.
But it wasn't like a conversation as much as it was one message with three perspectives kind of woven through. I enjoyed it, but it was definitely a different
Yes.
move. So we spent a little bit of time in the text because this is where we were grounded, but it was mostly application. Like, hey, how as followers of Jesus are we called to handle conflict? Kind of using Acts 15 as a case study, if you will. So we talked about owning our part. We talked about what makes for a good apology and like what is good forgiveness. But wanted to, in this deep dive, really spend more time in the text itself. Like, what was this conflict that was happening in the early church, and then maybe a couple different, maybe two different perspectives on kind of the nature of this conflict, because there are different assumptions I think that we make, even as we open up other areas of Paul's writing where we think, oh, this equals that, and that wasn't always the case. All right, so Dan, in Acts 15, what's going on with this Jerusalem council?
Well, as Paul says in Galatians chapter 1, if they are preaching any gospel other than Christ, let them be accursed. So what's happening in Acts chapter 15 is something that it actually makes a lot of sense, and it seems like a natural consequence to a successful first missionary journey.
Mm-hmm.
So Paul, Barnabas, and Mark, right? They're all traveling around, Joe.
Yep.
And then they're traveling into the Gentile world.
Yep.
And they are preaching about Jesus.
And they start in the synagogue.
That's right. And they talk to as many as they can, and then they go to the streets and they start talking to others. And both Jews, people with Jewish heritage, were accepting Christ, and Gentiles, non-Jews, people without any connection to the story of Yahweh, the Old Testament scriptures, even the Jerusalem where Jesus was crucified, like all of that, no connection at all. They're believing too.
Yep.
And so the question comes up, and it's kind of natural, because in the Jewish faith, heritage meant a lot, if not everything.
Everything. I mean, even like some of the different theological, ways to interpret or understand a lot of Paul's writing really comes down to is this like what did it mean to be just, like, where was justification found in the Old Testament? Like, and it was found in the people of God and the customs of the people of God.
Yes. And I mean, as Americans living in the Midwest in 2023, I just think we have a lot of distance from that kind of culture. Our family, like, lineage stuff is sometimes it gets wrapped up in celebrity kind of conversation. And so, like, very few people are known by their family of origin, except for the Kardashians, which is regrettable, and the Kennedys, and all of that. And we may know our individual histories, but Brad, like your Aslan family story and my, my Borth and my mom's last name is Zaro. Like I come from an Italian family where heritage means a lot, but what's different is heritage doesn't mean anything transferable between two people. So in this context,
sorry, would it like just completely change your identity as a person if you like weren't Italian?
Yes.
Like my wife,
Yes.
she knows somebody who did one of those like 23andMe and
Yeah.
like thought
Uh-oh.
they were full
Ooh.
100% Italian. They did the test. They were actually 0% Italian. They were Greek.
That happened to a friend of mine, actually.
really?
That's really funny. He
Yeah.
was primarily Greek.
Yeah.
Yeah, I won't do the test for that reason because grandma's Sicilian and grandpa's mainland, and that's enough for me. So,
Yeah.
no, you're right. It's actually very funny how proud I am and how much of a landmark that is in my own personal reference. But our culture isn't constructed that way. Theirs was.
Mm-hmm.
So for Jewish people, to believe in Jesus as the Messiah was a significant step.
Yep.
To believe that Jesus was actually changing the way heritage mattered was an even bigger step. And to believe that Jesus was changing the way Moses mattered was also a big step. So it all comes together because when a non-Jewish person believes in Jesus, they don't have the heritage, they don't have the connection to Moses, but they do have the connection to Jesus. And the question becomes, is this story that we're part of powerful enough to bring somebody in on the force of Christ alone?
Yeah.
And it was a big deal. And so what was happening is, just like anything, this kind of organic. People are talking to people and other people are believing. And some within the Christian group who had strong Jewish heritage inclinations start asking the question, hey, shouldn't all those people start acting more Jewish because now they're accepting Christ too?
Which for them, I mean, it was everything, as you already said. Like
That's right.
they didn't have a paradigm or a framework for that not being part of what it meant to follow God fully.
That's a really good way to say it. For them, they were asking questions of faithfulness. The best way I could say it is to just kind of bring it way down to the level of, well, my chair, a little lower than the table. But it's, were they Christian enough was the question. And so the council is held, and there's some significant voices that speak into it. Peter speaks.
So leader of the church, you remember
right.
from Acts chapter 10, like he had received a vision. He had been somebody who kept all of the law, all the customs, receives this vision. Hey, go, here's animals, go kill, eat. Completely flips his paradigm.
Yeah. James is there.
It's a half brother of Jesus,
Leader of the Jerusalem
leader
church.
of the Jerusalem church, which
right.
was very Jewish in nature, being Jerusalem.
Yeah, that's right. And he, that might be my favorite quote on the deep dive, besides what we cut out from earlier in this segment. I think what's interesting there is James isn't saying it's fine for those people over there to do their non-Jewish things. He was saying they're just as much a part of the Church of Jerusalem as the Church of Jerusalem is a part of the church over in,
Antioch
Ephesus or Antioch. That's right. Pamphylia, like all of these places. I don't know if I said that one right, but James speaking up and affirming this is really a big deal.
It's a huge deal.
And then the end of the story is that, okay, so everyone agreed with the exception of those who were just kind of, they were hardliners in a sense, and they stuck with that. And they continued to cause trouble, for Paul and for other churches. A lot of times there's a significant writing. It's on my shelf. I don't remember the author, but it was about Paul, and they drew up, I think what's true is that as these missionary journeys were happening, these hardliners were following behind and talking to the new Christians about being more Jewish. And so this is where writings from like Galatians, Romans, other things, like Paul's whole discourse in Romans chapter 4 about even Abraham was justified through faith in a relationship to Yahweh before he was circumcised, which was the big sign of the Jewish faith, shows that faith matters more. So this story, Acts 15, gives context for so many other things he says, including Galatians 5, where Paul gets really, really strong. And I'll try to say this more reverently than when we cut it. But Paul says, okay, if they're going to be so adamant about circumcision, then they should just show how zealous they are and remove everything. Paul gets sassy, gets a little saucy, but there's a lot at stake here because the question, how Christian is Christian enough, is a question that still plagues us today.
And so James, he presents this kind of this solution, the compromise. They accept it. Not really a compromise, but they accept it. Like, hey, that's a good move. What the Jerusalem Council is something that I don't know. I have these pictures in my mind. I think maybe of like it came from some of the
Ooh.
conversations in like the Reformation.
This is a great question. Yeah, what comes to mind? How were they seated?
Yeah.
What were they wearing?
Oh my goodness. So they're probably in like a big semicircle and there's a table with front. No, I'm just joking. Like it's a little Inquisition, right? It's kind of my mind. Or maybe they're, I don't know. It's like that famous painting where they're signing the, like the Constitution, or the Declaration of Independence. I forget which one.
Yeah.
And it's like this majestic, like,
Yeah, there's
thing,
glowing parts of the room.
And yet, whenever then you go and you read like accounts of those places, there was a lot of fighting and skirmishes. Like, I don't know. I kind of have both of those in my mind. Like some Rembrandt painting of these men with the halos, but then also like, hey, we're kind of heated, and I'm not sure that's the case here. And yet, that's where I think maybe that speaks more of like how we view conflict in our culture than it does actually how they handle conflict in theirs. That conflict now happens over on Twitter with people yelling at each other. And here,
yelling in each other's direction.
Yeah. So it seems though that at least when I've read about or heard about the Jerusalem Council, it's like you had these two factions, right? You had the Gentiles versus the Jewish Christians. When a more careful examination of the text it's actually a smaller, the Pharisaic sect of the Jewish Christians. Like you have James and Peter, who are both Jewish by heritage. They are very much affirming the gospel and the work that Paul and Barnabas and others are leading Gentiles to embrace.
Yeah, it's amazing what a few grumpy souls can accomplish if they desire to.
So there's a couple, like two different like interpretive pieces here. Paul alluded to both those. You want to give us just kind of a recap on that?
Are we talking about the conclusions about here are the four things then that all Christians would abide by? Okay. So the decision gets made that they're not going to put like the law of Moses or the Jewish heritage weight on anyone. But I like verse 11 a lot. But we believe that we will be saved through the grace of the Lord Jesus, just as they will. That's the most like dope Reformation verse in all of Scripture. Like faith alone in Christ alone. And then it says that all the assembly fell silent, and they listened to Barnabas and Paul as they talked about what God had done among the Gentiles. And they continue on. And then in verse 19, therefore, my judgment is that we should not trouble those who turn to God, but should write to them to abstain from the things polluted by idols, and from sexual immorality, and from what has been strangled, and from blood. For from ancient generations Moses has had in every city those who proclaim him, for he is read every Sabbath in the synagogues. So there's a few things going on here, and I'm going to be very candid. I am still learning what all of this means. So I've learned a lot in our getting ready for the sermon, and I learned a lot from listening to Paul and that. On first reading, it kind of sounds like they say, hey, we're not going to put all of Jewish heritage or all of the law of Moses on these new believers, but we are going to pick these four things that are going to make it clear that like we're not against Yahweh or something like that. Like we're going to do like the law of Moses light, L-I-T-E. And so that's one interpretation, and that shows up in study Bibles that they picked the things that would be most offensive to a Jewish person, because there is in Christianity the idea that we're not really here to just go offend. We are here to be set apart.
It's kind of the stumbling block argument. That's what is happening here.
That's right. Paul has a different perspective. He shared it on Sunday, and I think there's a lot of weight to it. The things that are listed here, yes, they are in the Mosaic Law, but more maybe relevantly, they show up in pagan idol worship practices, and so. It actually accounts for why it would matter to a Jewish person as well, and why it would even have been in the law in the first place. But the point seems to be, if you're a worshiper of Jesus, you're a worshiper of nothing and no one else. And those other practices, the ones that are listed, things polluted by idols, sexual immorality, things that have been strangled and blood, those things were all cultic idol worship, like known cultic idol worship cultural markers. And so it seems like what Paul is saying is like, hey, I don't care where you are when you believe, but when you believe, I'm going to use our phrase, Jesus matters most, and you need to make your choices by that.
Yeah, I think Tim Keller is a proponent of this particular thing. I think that's what Paul was talking about whenever we were doing our teaching team prep for this passage, which on that note, like, if you guys listen or follow news around evangelical circles, but Tim Keller, who's a pastor, theologian, biblical scholar, passed away over the weekend, end of last week. And I know I've been very influenced by his writings. He's one of there's a couple on my shelf where if you go into my my own personal library, like it's like, oh, I've got a lot of books by this one guy. And so anyway, I just wanted to acknowledge that here. He's made such a contribution to the church.
You know what's cool? Tim Keller's hope in Jesus as his life wound down a little too early is remarkable. Like if you can catch accounts of things that he said or said to family or to friends, it's pretty cool.
It's really cool.
It's inspirational.
It's really cool. So yeah, basically this big idea, hey, don't pull Jesus into these other pagan spaces of worship.
That's right.
And you see throughout the New Testament whenever Paul is writing to different to different churches, different groups, like this idea of like syncretism, of like combining the message of the gospel with other worldviews, other religions, other thoughts. I love how you just said that. Like Jesus matters most, and Jesus only matters most when he matters only, in terms of our worship.
That's right.
So following Acts 15, or not following, I guess it's still in Acts 15, the end of Acts 15. So following this situation of the Jerusalem Council, there's a letter that goes out where again, we don't have Twitter. No one's live tweeting this event, although that could have been amazing. We don't have Twitter. We don't have kind of modern means of communication. So a letter goes out to Gentile believers just affirming, hey, here's what was discussed and here's what was decided on. Not that it was authoritative in the sense that like you have apostles right there, but
I love this letter. I mean, what it says in the text is, since we heard that some people went out from us and troubled you with words, unsettling your minds, although we gave them no instructions, it seemed good to us, having been in agreement to choose people and send them to you, with Paul, beloved Barnabas and Paul, and they're sending Judas and Silas. It's just like, they're like, we didn't create this mess, but we're willing to like do everything we can to like just to comfort you and the Lord.
Yes, exactly.
It was good.
So the letter goes out, and then Paul and Barnabas, who, they had traveled together along with John Mark on the first missionary journey, they're actually going to separate. And we don't really know the full nature of their disagreement. We know that Mark maybe wasn't always there. They separate, but they separate in the Lord, and they're okay with it.
Mark, it's interesting. Mark just dipped on him. I mean, that's
left.
what the kids say.
He just goes. Yeah.
They were going along, Acts 14, I think, or maybe even 13, and like things are going well, and Mark just goes home.
Yeah.
And like, there's so much of me that wants to make jokes about, we all know that friend.
We all know that friend. Yeah.
We don't actually know
or even like Paul and Barnabas. I made a joke, a couple weeks ago that, Barnabas, he's the encourager. So of course he's gonna go back to Mark and encourage him and be part. And Paul he gets kind of the rap for being this, fully focused, high commitment, doesn't really tolerate a whole lot of, the dude shipwrecked, he was beaten, I don't know, he'd be kind of a hard person, I think, to travel with at times.
He's mysterious. He self-describes himself in 2 Corinthians 11 because of what people are saying he's not. He's aware of his critics. Yeah. And he says, you say that what I write is strong, but I'm meek and timid when I'm with you. Yeah. So it's just totally it's very interesting. It is interesting that what we do get, I mean, it's not a full explanation, but it says that Paul thought it best not to take with them one who had withdrawn from them in Pamphylia and had not gone with him to the work. And who knows? Was that just a line in the sand, or was there more to it? We don't know.
In that process, you now have more gospel work being done.
Yeah.
Paul joins with Silas, then later Timothy joins them. Barnabas and Mark, they go off as well. And so, anyway, you see God still working.
Frequently, we bring up how translations are art and kind of interesting. One of my favorite, most interesting things is verse 39. And there arose a sharp disagreement so that they separated. And it's like, I at some point, I'd be very intrigued to go back to the original Greek and see
what were the words there?
What were they getting at? And it's interesting. I mean, sharp disagreement seems like a very pointed thing to say in English. It feels very formal.
Yeah.
My curiosity is piqued, but again, I can't really make a judgment on it. I could just say that is an interesting translation choice right there. Sure.
Cool. Well, anyway, that is Acts 15. We will catch back up with Acts 16 next week. And just as we always want to say, hey, if you have any questions, we'd love to answer. We'd love to, try to answer, love to engage. So leave any questions in the comments. You can always email us at podcast@calvary.church. You can find this podcast, this resource, and more on our website, calvary.church/resources, or anywhere you listen to podcasts. Thanks for joining us. Thanks for listening. And as always, keep your Bibles open because Jesus matters most.
Thanks for listening to The Deep Dive, a Calvary Church Media Productions podcast. Be sure to subscribe and leave a review wherever you listen to podcasts.
And if anyone has a shorter table, info@calvary.church.